Okay, let's pick up where we left off. If you remember, we started chapter 15 last time. This chapter is kind of a short chapter, just kind of piggybacking on top of talking about the whole process of infection in chapter 14. And we're just going through some terminology of epidemiology, thinking about how infectious disease are passed through populations, and again, a lot of terminology. These are mostly terms that you've heard of before, but remember, we want to be more than just familiar with the terms. You should be able to explain to somebody else what these terms actually mean, and I'll try to give you some examples again so that you can understand better, but don't memorize the examples. All right, so I think we left it last time. We had finished talking about, we were, like I said, the incidence, the prevalence, the epidemic, endemic, those kind of terms. But before that, when we think about the portals of exit of an infection, where do these microbes, where do these pathogens go once they have left a human host? Well, the places where those pathogens are maintained, we referred to as reservoirs. All right, so this is where a pathogen naturally lives or reproduces. Those reservoirs can be living or non-living. Let's look at the living ones first. In a living reservoir, that individual may or may not be affected by the disease. Sorry, affected, not infected. Okay, so typically we think about a reservoir really not being affected, like they don't look sick at all, but that's not always the case. If the reservoir is an animal, and let me specify, we're not talking about an insect here. We have another name for when insects pass disease. When an animal, when a pathogen is maintained in an animal, we call the infections that they cause zoonotic infections. Okay, so infections that, again, are maintained in animals, and humans would get these infections only when they have some kind of contact with animals. Okay, so these are infections caused by contact with animals. Okay, and a lot of what we refer to as emerging diseases have some kind of animal reservoir. So by emerging disease, I mean a disease that we consider pretty new, or is only basically we're recognizing recently that it's able to infect humans. Like the SARS coronavirus that caused that severe acute respiratory syndrome back in 2000. We now understand that coronavirus reservoir was bats. And I showed a picture of a bat here because we know that there's a ton of infections, mostly viruses, that bats can carry. And researchers have been kind of stumped as to why that's the case, but when you think about the habits of bats, it kind of makes sense because they travel long distances every day because they can fly, and then during the night, and then when they come back together during the day in their caves or whatever, they form big colonies where the bats are, basically congregating right on top of each other, and they poop and pee on each other, and it's just, if one bat would get sick when it flies out at night, it's going to get lots of other bats sick when they come together again. So bats are a really common reservoir. Like I said, they carry lots of different things, rabies, Ebola, It was suspected that COVID had a reservoir in bats. I don't know if we'll ever know that for sure. We haven't found evidence of that. There's evidence that COVID may have escaped from a lab. But again, I don't know if we'll ever know that for sure. So lots of other animals can serve as reservoirs, things like dogs or raccoons or possums for rabies, for example. So again, an animal reservoir doesn't just have to be a bat. Humans can also serve as reservoirs. And I take a little bit of an issue the way your book defines some things. My understanding is that humans are considered a reservoir. Well, of course, lots of diseases have human reservoirs, right? We're passing them back and forth to each other all the time. Colds, flu, lots of different things. But if humans are not displaying symptoms, then they are considered a carrier. And like I said, your book defines that the term carrier a little differently. It says that a carrier can be asymptomatic or ill. But the way I'm going to use it, and the way I would argue, is that humans are reservoirs when they are ill, and if they're not ill, we specifically call them a carrier. Okay, so a human carrier can either be passive or active. If a human's a passive carrier, that means that the human is not infected. Okay, so an example here, say a nurse that doesn't wash hands between patients. Okay, so that nurse is not infected himself or herself, but they take whatever microbe from one patient and pass it on to the next patient. It's just, again, a passive carrier. If a human is an active carrier, this is an infected individual that can pass disease. And again, this individual is not showing symptoms themselves. So it may be that in some cases that individual's just not showing symptoms yet. So that individual may be in the incubation phase or maybe the convalescent period. A good example of this is Typhoid Mary. So there was a woman named Mary Malone. This was back in the early 1900s, and she had typhoid fever and had recovered from it. But some people, even after they recover, their gallbladder stays infected, so they're constantly shedding that bacterium, Salmonella typhi, both in their feces and their urine. So this woman, Mary, she wasn't ill, but she worked as a cook, and I am guessing that hygiene wasn't, what it is today, and she probably didn't wash her hands after she went to the bathroom, and she kind of went from job to job, and everywhere she went, people that she cooked for were getting ill with typhoid fever. So they finally figured it out, traced it back to her, and it's just a really sad case. She was really belligerent and wouldn't stop cooking for people, so they ended up kind of keeping her under house arrest for the rest of her life. So lots of infections can be spread by active carriers. Again, people that are infected but not showing symptoms, things like herpes, HIV, hepatitis B, lots of different things. So, we want to distinguish again between whether a human that's not showing symptoms is either a passive carrier or an active carrier. Sometimes reservoirs are non-living. So it can be things like soil, water, or food. So that If a pathogen is maintained in the soil, there's not a lot of examples of that, but we know that endospores are maintained and can hang out in the soil for a long time. So for things like tetanus or anthrax, we're going to talk more about those infections in a few weeks. Those can just kind of hang out in the soil indefinitely. A water reservoir, any pathogens that are shed in feces are going to be maintained for at least a certain amount of time in the water. Things like cryptosporidium, that's the one we talked about that survived the sewage treatment plant in Milwaukee, and 400,000 people got diarrhea all about the same time back in the 90s. Cholera is maintained in water. This picture, actually, going back to typhoid fever, like I said, can be passed in the urine. Well, there was a big case study done back in the 1930s. I think there was a town that was getting new pipe laid for its water supply, and they had this outbreak of typhoid fever in the town, and they traced it back to one of the workers that was laying the water pipes. He habitually urinated in the pipes when he was at work. So, and people died from that outbreak. That's pretty not very common for a pathogen to be passed through urine. So we'll say or urine. And then sometimes food can be considered a reservoir. So any foodborne disease. And it's a little confusing. Sometimes we're going to consider water or food actually a vehicle of transmission. So we'll talk about that. It all depends on the length of time that the pathogen is maintained either in the water or the food. If it's there a long time, we might call it a reservoir. If it's only there for a short period or only survives a short period, we might be more likely to call it a vehicle. All right, so how are pathogens transferred from that reservoir where they're maintained into a new host? We have ways of describing that. We call them modes of transmission. All right, so contact transmission, that's probably by far the most common method of transmission. So we think about person to person. So things like kissing, intercourse, mother to child transmission, maybe even a handshake. Okay, so you have direct contact with the diseased individual. Droplet transmission is considered a form of direct contact. That's those large droplets that spew out of our mouth, sometimes just when we talk, but also when we cough or when we sneeze. Okay, so this is when it's transferred when people are closer than 1 meter from each other. Okay, so 1 meter, that's about 3 feet. All right, so pretty close contact. Again, you can get sneezed on, coughed on, that's droplet transmission. Sometimes the contact is indirectly by some fomite. And I think we defined that previously, but remember, a fomite is some non-living object. So that can be, you grabbed a door handle where, somebody that was sick, maybe they just sneezed on their hand and you touch that door handle and there's some viruses on there that might live for a short period of time. It could be the toy at daycare that the kid there in the morning chewed on it and somebody in the afternoon chews on the same toy and now they're sick. It could be the computer keyboard that somebody sneezed on, you touch, and then you wipe your eyes or rub your nose, and now you're sick. Okay. We know that COVID can be spread by any of these methods, especially by droplet transmission, but certainly, less likely by some kind of fomite transmission, but especially because it's respiratory by those large droplets that are, say, sneezed or coughed out. There could be some vehicle that's involved, water, food, or air. Pathogens transmitted by some means. A waterborne pathogen is usually passed due to poor sanitation. Okay, so pathogens that are transmitted, what we say, by the fecal-oral route, meaning the feces gets in the water is not treated, somebody else, whatever, washes their hands in that water, and they rub their mouth, and now they're sick. The World Health Organization, the WHO, estimates that about 500,000 people die every year just due to drinking contaminated drinking water. So still a huge problem. Most of the time, our water is safe to drink here. Every once in a while, we have a fail, maybe a big rain, and that overcomes our sewage treatment plants. Foodborne. If food is a vehicle, that can be when food's contaminated by poor handling practices. It could be the cafeteria worker that has a staph infection on their hand and the food gets on it, and now the staph is in the food. More often it's, the food's been contaminated, like the meat was contaminated when it was butchered, and then if we don't cook it fully, then that can lead to illness. And air is a vehicle, we'll say, by dust and fine particles suspended in the air. So sometimes we refer to this as droplet nuclei or even aerosols. Okay, sort of the same thing. Those are those really tiny droplets, like if somebody, you get an unstifled sneeze, the large droplets kind of fall out of the air right away, but there's going to be these very fine droplets that stay suspended for a long time, or like I said, they kind of hitch a ride on dust. So there are some infections. TB can be airborne. Rarely coronavirus. We usually say that these need to travel greater than 1 meter to be considered airborne. Measles is airborne. Hantavirus, that's another one. Hantavirus is found in mouse urine and feces, and that virus can become aerosolized in dust particles when those feces or urine is disturbed. So that's more prevalent kind of down in the Southwest. Okay, lastly, we could have some kind of insect serving as the transmissor. And if the disease does involve an insect, we call that insect a vector. Okay, so vectors are living organisms that carry disease. I say here usually insects, but I haven't been able to find an example where anything other than an insect was referred to as a vector. So an arthropod or an insect. And we could consider that insect either a biological vector or a mechanical vector. A biological vector, that just means that the pathogen or the microbe is growing and reproducing inside of the insect. So in other words, part of that pathogen's life cycle has to take place inside of that insect. If you remember when we talked about malaria, the life cycle of that protozoa malaria, part of that life cycle is in the human, part of it is in Anopheles mosquitoes. All right, we can't. A person can't give malaria to another person. There has to be part of the development of that protozoa that takes place inside the mosquito. Okay, so that's an example of a biological vector, mosquito carrying malaria. Bubonic plague has part of its life cycle. It's a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Part of its life cycle is inside fleas that live on rats. A vector could be considered a mechanical vector if the insect is a passive carrier. So the best example I can think of that, so this means that basically the insect isn't infected per se with that pathogen. Best example I could think of that was a fly that lands on, say, the pile of manure in the farmyard and gets, whatever, some kind of bacteria, that gets on its legs, and then it goes off and lands on the potato salad at the picnic. Okay, so that bacteria can be transferred from the feces to the manure to the food that we eat, then we can get sick. Okay, so in other words, the insect is not really what we'll say infected. It's just carrying it. Okay, so our old textbook had, I think this was from the old textbook. Yeah, I think so. Just some common zoonotic diseases, just to wrap up with here. Just if you want some more examples, don't memorize this. Again, it gives both all different kinds of microbes, protozoan, fungal, bacterial, viral. Just gives some examples. Just gets you used to using that terminology. What's the reservoir? What's the mode of transmission? So look at that if you're interested. Okay, that's it for now.